The heavy bay doors of the Halifax surplus auction rolled shut with a metallic groan that sounded final, like the lid of something being sealed for good. Inside, men who moved freight and guarded oil terminals for a living were placing six-figure bids on dogs trained to kill. Then a young woman in a borrowed canvas coat stepped past the rope line with nothing but a folded bank slip and said one word, and 30 combat-broken animals went still at once. The warehouse sat on the edge of the Bedford Basin, close enough to the water that the air carried salt and diesel in equal measure. Inside, the lighting was the flat industrial kind that made everyone look slightly grey, and the concrete floor still held the cold of the harbour, even in late spring. This was the Atlantic Tactical Surplus Sale, a twice-yearly event where decommissioned military and police dogs, the ones too old, too injured, or too volatile for continued service, were sold off to whoever could pay. Nobody came here looking for a family pet. The room was filled with private security contractors, mining company reps who needed perimeter dogs for remote sites, and a handful of collectors who liked owning something dangerous. Whitney Sorrel didn't belong among them, and she knew it. 26 years old, hair pulled back in a hasty knot, wearing her late father's old field jacket because it was the only thing warm enough, and it still, faintly, smelled like him. She held a single folded slip of paper, a bank draft for $2,650, everything left in her account after 3 years of working 2 jobs and putting herself through a paralegal program she'd since put on hold. She wasn't here for any of the dogs being paraded across that stage for sport. She was here for one specific animal, Lot 17, a Dutch shepherd named Diesel. She let her eyes close for just a second, let the noise of the room blur out, and let herself remember. 5 years back, Diesel hadn't been a scarred liability with a kennel card listing 3 bite incidents. He'd been an awkward, oversized puppy who used to fall asleep against her father's boots on the back step of their house outside Dartmouth. Diesel belonged, originally and completely, to her father, Master Corporal Theo Sorrel, who served with a Joint Forces K-9 unit attached to a NATO operation overseas. The two of them had trained together, bunked together, and deployed together twice. To Whitney, Diesel wasn't a piece of equipment. He was the closest thing she had to a sibling, the third presence in a house that was usually just her and her dad between his postings. On the evenings he was home, the 3 of them would sit out back, Diesel's head heavy across her knees, while her father told the parts of his job that were safe to tell a kid. 4 years ago, the calls stopped coming. Theo's team was caught in a coordinated ambush during a night patrol outside a forward base, the kind of incident that gets a single paragraph in an official report and no further explanation. What Whitney eventually pieced together, mostly second-hand, was that her father had stayed back to cover the team's withdrawal and never made the extraction point. When the recovery team reached his position at first light, Diesel was still there, bleeding from a wound along his flank, refusing to let anyone near the body until he recognized a familiar voice. After the funeral, Whitney asked, then begged, the Department of National Defense to release Diesel to her. They explained, not unkindly but firmly, that the dog was government property with an estimated value north of $40,000, fully trained and not eligible for civilian release except through formal channels that could take years, if they happened at all. Diesel was patched up and reassigned, first to a base perimeter unit, then loaned out to a contracted security detail. He was never the same dog. Handlers noted a pattern: sudden aggression, refusal to take commands from anyone but the most senior handler present, nights where he wouldn't settle no matter what. Eventually, the file was stamped unsuitable for continued service, and word filtered down through a friend of her father's named Cole Bramwell, a retired handler who'd served 2 tours alongside Theo, that Diesel was headed for liquidation at this exact auction. Moving along to Lot 16, gentlemen, a real workhorse out of the RCMP program. The auctioneer's voice cracked over the PA, dragging Whitney back into the present. His name was Garrett Voss, A heavy-set man with a voice built for exactly this kind of room. Whitney pressed closer to the barricade, watching men bid on German shepherds the way other people bid on used trucks. 8-5, someone called, barely glancing up from his phone. 9-2 to the gentleman from Harlow Tactical. Garrett fired back without missing a beat. Do I hear 10? Whitney felt her stomach drop. $10,000, tossed out like pocket change. She looked down at the bank slip in her hand. Her entire savings wouldn't even open the bidding on half these dogs. But she'd made a promise standing at her father's grave at the veterans section of the cemetery in Dartmouth, and she wasn't leaving without trying. A side door clattered open, and two handlers backed into the staging area, leaning their weight against the pull of two catch poles. At the end of them was Lot 17. Diesel didn't look anything like the dog from her memory. His coat, once a deep reddish brindle, was dull and patchy. A scar ran pale and jagged along his left shoulder, and he was missing a notch out of one ear. A thick leather muzzle covered his jaws, and a low snarl rolled up from somewhere deep in his chest as he fought the restraint with everything he had. He looked feral, but underneath all of it, Whitney could still see the animal who'd lain beside her father's body in the dirt for hours, refusing to leave. Settle down, Garrett barked, eyeing the shepherd with a mixture of caution and grudging respect. Lot 17, Dutch shepherd, male, 6 years old, 2 overseas deployments. Full disclosure here, folks. This one's got a bite history, 2 handlers in the last 18 months. He's not suited for patrol work or public-facing duty. Recommended strictly for static perimeter guard in a controlled environment. Bidding starts at $1,200. Whitney's hand shook as she raised her numbered paddle. She stepped right up to the velvet rope. $1,200, Garrett called, scanning the floor. For a moment, nobody moved. The buyers were sizing Diesel up and not liking what they saw. A dog that bites is a liability even for men who didn't mind owning something dangerous. Whitney's voice came out thinner than she wanted. $1,200. Garrett raised an eyebrow at the young woman in the oversized jacket. $1,200 to the lady up front. Do I hear more? Okay, 2,000. Cut in a smooth voice from the back. She turned. The man was Desmond Kerrigan, a regional manager for a private logistics outfit that ran security on cargo routes out of the port. He hadn't even looked up from his phone when he bid. To him, Diesel wasn't an animal with a history. He was a discount alarm system for a container yard. Whitney's chest tightened. She had $2,650 total, and if she put it all on the table now, she'd have nothing left for transport, food, or the vet bills a dog in this state would obviously need. She raised her paddle anyway. $2,650. Her voice cracked on the last word. Kerrigan finally looked up, taking in her coat, her plain boots, the kind of bid that told him exactly how little money was actually behind it. A small, unkind smile crossed his face. He didn't need this dog. He just didn't like losing to a kid. 5,000, he said lazily, sliding his phone into his coat pocket. A ripple of murmurs went through the room. Way too much for a damaged dog. And everyone there knew it was no longer about the dog at all. Whitney's stomach hollowed out. She was done. There was nothing left in the account. Nothing left to offer. She looked over at Diesel, still thrashing weakly against the catch poles, and pictured him chained to a fence at some remote depot for the rest of his life, treated as a problem to be managed rather than an animal who deserved better. 5,000 going once, Garrett said, lifting his gavel. Going twice. Something in Whitney refused to accept it. Before she'd fully decided to move, she'd already ducked under the rope. Miss, you can't be back here, a security guard shouted, starting toward her. She didn't stop. She crossed straight into the marked bite radius around the staging platform, 15 feet of concrete that every handler in the room understood as a kill zone for an animal in this state. The 2 men holding Diesel's poles went rigid with alarm. Get back! Get back now! One of them yelled, planting his boots. The other reached for a taser at his hip, ready to drop the dog before it could reach her. Diesel's eyes locked onto her movement, pupils blown wide. Every muscle in his body coiled. He lunged against the poles hard enough that the metal groaned under the strain. Whitney didn't flinch. She stopped 6 feet from him, squared her shoulders, and pulled in a breath. When she spoke, it wasn't in her own voice. It was lower, slower, shaped deliberately into the cadence her father used to use, the one that could stop Diesel mid-stride on a training field. Diesel. The name cracked across the silent warehouse like something physical. The dog froze mid-lunge, ears flicking. Whitney took one more step, ignoring the men yelling behind her, and held his gaze. "Stand down! For Corporal Theo Sorrel." What happened next didn't make sense to anyone watching. Diesel didn't just stop pulling. He went utterly still, the fight draining out of his body so fast that the handlers, still braced against the poles, nearly stumbled forward. And it didn't stop with Diesel. The Halifax facility was holding close to 30 working dogs in the pens behind the stage, and for the past hour they'd been a steady wall of barking and pacing. The instant Whitney spoke that command, the instant a name was dropped into the room with that kind of conviction, something rippled backward through every kennel. Within 5 seconds, the entire building had gone quiet enough to hear the hum of the lights overhead and the ragged breathing of the men still standing frozen near the stage. Kerrigan lowered his phone, his smirk gone. The security guard who'd been moving toward Whitney stopped dead, hands hovering uselessly in the air. Even Garrett Voss, who'd auctioned off thousands of dogs over the years, lowered his gavel with his mouth slightly open. On the platform, Diesel stood rigid, head tilted, eyes suddenly sharp and present in a way they hadn't been all day. He pulled in a breath through his nose, taking in the scent of the old field jacket, the one she'd grabbed off the hook by the door that morning, without quite letting herself think about why. Slowly, he lowered himself to the concrete and sat, perfectly squared, and let out a long, high whine that didn't sound like anything an animal that size should be capable of making. Whitney felt the tears come and didn't bother wiping them away. Garrett cleared his throat into the mic, the sound enormous in the silence. He looked down at his clipboard, then back up at her. "Miss, who exactly are you?" "Whitney Sorrel," she said, her voice unsteady but holding. "Master Corporal Theo Sorrel was my father. That's his dog." The room stayed silent a long moment, 50 contractors and buyers, staring between the young woman and the shepherd, now sitting calm as a stone in front of her. Garrett flipped to the second page of the file, scanning the redacted service record. His jaw tightened. "Corporal Sorrel," he muttered into the mic, voice flattened out of its usual theatrical pitch. "Forward operating base. Overseas deployment." That's something." "Touching," Kerrigan cut in, stepping forward, his shoes clicking against the concrete with a confidence that hadn't faded one bit. "But this is a liquidation sale, Garrett, not a memorial service. 5,000 is on the floor. Let's move it along. We've still got the explosives unit dogs to get through." Whitney turned on him, fists clenched at her sides. "He's not an asset. He's a veteran. He stayed with my dad when nobody else could reach him. You don't get to put him behind a fence in some shipping yard." Kerrigan's smile only sharpened. "Sweetheart, he's a liability with a bite file. I'm doing everyone a favor, taking him off the government's hands. Step back before he decides you're next." A chair scraped hard against concrete somewhere at the back of the room. A man rose from the last row, tall, broad through the shoulders, wearing a worn field coat that had clearly seen more than one posting. A scar cut pale through his beard, and his eyes had the flat, unreadable look of someone who'd spent a long time somewhere most people never saw. As he walked down the center aisle, the crowd parted without being asked. They knew exactly who he was. His name was Callister Doane, founder of Northbridge Tactical, one of the most respected private extraction outfits operating out of Atlantic Canada, and before that, 22 years in the same joint K-9 program Theo Sorrel had served in. He ignored Kerrigan entirely and walked straight to the rope beside Whitney, looking down at Diesel, who tracked his approach with sharp, focused eyes. "I was on the recovery team that night," Doane said, his voice low and carrying without effort. He wasn't addressing the room, he was speaking to her. Smoke was so thick you couldn't see 2 feet in front of you, but we heard the dog before we saw anything else. He nodded toward Diesel. He'd taken shrapnel across the shoulder, lost part of an ear, and he was still standing over your father, holding the position. 3 hostiles tried to push the flank after Theo went down. Diesel took all 3, held that ground alone for the better part of 40 minutes before we got there. A low murmur moved through the crowd. These were men who understood exactly what that meant, and the way they looked at Diesel changed in real time, from broken liability to something closer to a soldier who'd earned the right to be treated like one. Doane turned to face Kerrigan directly, and something in Kerrigan's posture shrank under the attention. You want to chain Theo Sorrel's dog to a fence to guard your shipping containers. Kerrigan straightened, trying to hold his ground in front of the room. It's an open sale, Doane. I've got the high bid, 5,000. If you want him, you bid. 10, Doane said, without a beat of hesitation. Whitney looked up at him, stunned. $10,000 she didn't have, offered by a stranger who somehow had every reason in the world to make it. Kerrigan's jaw tightened, his pride clearly outweighing his sense. 12. 15, called a man near the side wall, leaning on a cane. 17, shouted someone else from the front row, not even looking up from the stage. 20,000, Doane said, flat and final. Kerrigan threw his hands up. This is absurd. You're inflating the price of a defective animal out of sentiment. He turned and shoved his way toward the exit, muttering something under his breath that nobody bothered repeating. Doane looked up at the stage. 20. Close it out, Garrett. The gavel came down hard against the block. Going once. Going twice. Sold. Whitney's knees nearly gave out. Diesel had been pulled out of Kerrigan's hands, but he was still, technically, somebody else's property, and that somebody wasn't her. Doane reached into his coat and pulled out a checkbook, scribbling quickly before tearing the slip free and holding it out to her. She stared at it, confused, until the number resolved itself. $20,000 made out to the auction house. The memo line read simply, "For Theo." "I didn't buy him," Doane said, a tired half-smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. "You did. I just covered the difference." "I can't pay this back," Whitney stammered. "I have $2,600. It would take me years. Your father pulled me out of a vehicle that was on fire outside Kandahar in 2011, Doane said quietly. Took small arms fire doing it. I've been carrying that debt a long time. Today it's settled. Take the check. Take your dog home." She crossed to the auctioneer's table with trembling hands and laid both the bank draft and Doane's check on the metal surface. Garrett stamped the paperwork. Lot 17, transferred to civilian custody. He looked at the handlers still flanking the stage. "Bring him down." They hesitated, glancing at each other. Diesel was calm now, but his file still listed him as a level 4 bite risk, and nobody wanted to be the one who got it wrong. Slowly, they guided him down the ramp toward Whitney, his muscles still coiled tight even as his eyes stayed locked on her. When he was within 5 feet, the lead handler held firm. "Ma'am, we need to get him into a transport crate. He's still muzzled for a reason. If he comes out of this and snaps, you won't have time to react." "Let him go," Whitney said. Her voice wasn't an imitation of anyone this time. It was entirely her own. "I can't authorize that, miss." "Drop the poles," Doane said from behind her, his tone allowing for no further discussion. The handlers exchanged one more look and unclipped the catches. The poles fell away, clattering against the concrete. Diesel was free. 50 armed, hardened men held their breath at once, hands drifting unconsciously toward holsters. Every one of them braced for the worst. Whitney didn't hesitate. She lowered herself to her knees on the cold floor, making herself small, palms open and empty in front of her. Diesel took one step, then another, closing the distance until he was inches from her face. He lowered his head and worked his way along her hands, her sleeves, finally pressing his nose flat against the chest of the old field jacket. 4 years of her father's scent, still faintly held in the fabric, hit him all at once. His whole body shuddered. The dog who'd survived firefights and shrapnel let out a long, broken exhale that sounded almost human. He pushed his head into the curve of her neck and let his full weight lean into her. She wrapped both arms around him, face buried in his coarse fur. "I've got you," she whispered against the torn edge of his ear. "I've got you. You're not fighting anymore. You're coming home with me." She reached behind his head, found the heavy buckle of the muzzle. "Whitney, careful," one of the handlers warned, stepping forward. Doane put a hand up, stopping him without a word. She unfastened the buckle and pulled the leather away, letting it drop to the floor. Diesel didn't bare his teeth. He didn't pull back. Freed of the muzzle, he simply pressed his tongue once against her wet cheek and let out a low, steady whine, the sound of something broken finally being allowed to rest. Whitney stood, legs unsteady, but somehow stronger than they'd felt in years. She clipped a plain leash to his collar. "Heel," she said softly. Diesel rose instantly, pressing his shoulder against her leg, falling into step beside her, like he'd never been anywhere else. As she walked the length of the center aisle toward the doors, the crowd of contractors and buyers parted without a word, some nodding, others simply lowering their eyes. It wasn't only a woman walking a dog out of a warehouse. It was a fallen soldier's legacy being walked home, and every person in that room who'd ever worn a uniform understood it without needing it explained. Doane watched them go from beside the stage, a faint, tired smile on his face, before turning back toward the shadows at the rear of the building. A year on, the wind coming off the Bedford Basin carried the smell of salt and cut grass across the small backyard of a rented house outside Dartmouth. Whitney sat on the back steps with a textbook open across her knees, catching up on the coursework she'd finally gone back to finish. At her feet, stretched out in a patch of late afternoon sun, lay a Dutch shepherd, his coat brushed and glossy now, the scar along his shoulder faded to a thin, pale line. He was asleep, paws twitching now and then, chasing something only he could see. The nights of pacing and startling at every sound had stopped months ago. Diesel's war, as far as anyone could tell, was finally over. He was exactly where he was meant to be, lying in the sun at the feet of the daughter of the man he'd once died trying to protect, unbroken and home for good.